Bring Me the Horizon pretty much built their whole fan base and their brand by capitalizing on the whole metalcore genre and bringing it kind of towards the masses with a bit of a pop sensibility to them. They knew how to write hooks, they knew how to write choruses. Their songs generally followed the same patterns, and a lot of the guitar parts really sounded the same through the first couple albums that they had, and they were never really quite heavy enough to be considered anything impactful in the metal genre, but they were never really too poppy where they were just completely dismissed as being a kids band or just a straight up pop band in general. And they really found this kind of niche with a few other bands as well, and they kind of really honed that sound with their first couple albums. Their last album, Sempiternal, really moved away from that a bit. It was a much more mature sound that they had. It dealt with a lot more mature issues and more in-depth issues that they had it, subject matter like religion and death and a lot of things that just you hadn't seen them really tackle before, at least not with complete sincerity at all. And they were just these more abstract ideas that they kind of embraced with that album. And the sound itself was still heavy enough where it wasn't going to completely alienate fans of their past work, but it definitely brought in a lot of new fans and people that probably hadn't given them a chance before. There was enough there to kind of make it reasonable to listen to that album. Well, Sempiternal was the band embracing a more mature sound. This album, That's the Spirit, is really the band just completely departing from that sound overall and just pushing into something that they really hadn't embraced before. There's a lot of the heaviness of their previous work has kind of been toned down a lot. A lot of it's gone. There's almost no screaming on here at all. There's growling a little bit, but nothing that was there previously that, a lot of fans may kind of lament that's not on here, but it makes way for more interesting ideas that they've kind of brought to the table with this album, That's the Spirit. There's a lot more alternative rock and kind of post-grunge feel to the songs, like tracks like Happy Song or True Friends, for instance, really kind of have that whole post-grunge movement from the late 90s and early 2000s that was popularized by bands like Saliva or Seether, bands like that. There's definitely a lot of going on. Or even bands like Linkin Park, for instance. I mean, in my original review of this album, I compared it to their album Meteora, which, looking back at it, I really think a better comparison would actually be, still sticking with Linkin Park, Minutes to Midnight, because that was where the band started to embrace different ideas that they had in, and they were kind of breaking out of that whole rap metal shell that they had started with Hybrid Theory and with even that carried on into Meteora. And I mean, despite the fact that the song Throne sounds off of That's the Spirit sounds exactly like Fate off of Meteora, I really think in terms of tone and sound, Minutes to Midnight's definitely a better comparison overall, just because it was the same point where Linkin Park started to kind of shed their old sound and experiment a little bit more and bring in a little bit more elements outside from different genres and different sounds and things like that. And that's what we get with That's the Spirit. I mean, instrumentally, it's completely different than what we'd expect from Bring Me Horizon. I mean, they heavily incorporate electronic work that actually works on here. Vocal manipulation, layering, just really ambient sounds throughout this album that they really hadn't embraced as much on previous albums, where there was definitely electronic work, but it wasn't used to the extent that it is here or to the effect that it is here, and they really pulled it off on this album. There's a lot of songs that are heavy on the electronic work that almost become like kind of alternative rock pop songs that you might expect on the radio, but there's still a bit of an edge to them even so. And there's just a lot going on that you really didn't really get from this band previously, incorporating the violins strongly, even though they had in the past. It's more it's done better on this album, I would say. And there's even a weird saxophone solo at one point on the ending track, "Oh No," and it just comes out of nowhere. But it's nice and it's interesting, and it just kind of gives a little bit of life to the songs themselves and helps them from fading into mediocrity, I would say. And kind of, it's an experiment that could have gone wrong, but I think they actually pulled it off with that on this album and on that track. Tonally, this album is really, really dark and depressing, which, if you haven't noticed, is something that really draws me to music in general. It's just something that I generally connect to. I mean, lyrically, they've come a long way on this album from their first album with lines like "The sun goes down and so does she." There's just so much more depth to the lyrical content on this album. And even previously, they were starting to kind of incrementally get better over time with each album release. They started to kind of build up a little bit. And we get with That's the Spirit, it completely just departs in terms of their sound, but it's improved overall. If they're taking a different approach to what we know is Bring Me Horizon, but they've actually done it well. Again, it's something that they kind of experimented with. This album is a bit of an experiment that could have gone horribly wrong. I mean, they could have just released something that was boring, stale, been there, done that kind of feeling, but they didn't, and it actually feels nice and exciting and fresh, the way that they actually done this. It's a very emotional album and a very sad album overall. There's a lot of talk of pain and struggle, and particularly the sound "Drown," for instance, which, if you really know about what Ollie Sykes went through during this album and during his life with the struggle with addiction and things, he came out and finally kind of admitted that he had problems and was going through rehab and things like that. You really kind of feel that song a little bit more, just knowing what the song is actually referring to. But it kind of fits anybody's story, and that's one thing I think a lot of people can kind of connect to on this, is just how dark and grim this album gets at times. But there are still some moments of hope. There are some kind of, looking out for the future and talking about love and things like that, and just connections. And there's a lot that's going on in this album, and it doesn't come off as cheesy. It really does come off feeling as honest, which is why it actually works and why they were able to pull it off this time, I really feel. So That's the Spirit, I mean, is just, it really kind of shapes things for the band and just brings in things that they hadn't done before and just takes them up to a whole different level. So how does this album hold up after a year? I would say very well. I mean, I wasn't expecting it to hold up as well as it did, to be honest. I mean, it kind of pushed towards, like I said, the alt-rock and pop scene, which is where a lot of bands kind of get lost among the sea of other bands that sound exactly the same or similar. But I don't think That's the Spirit really falls into that trap, and I think it manages to kind of escape that a bit. It actually does hold up over time. I mean, my original review, I talked about how I felt there were some songs that actually would fade on me over time, but I think they've actually grown on me. The songs that I wasn't thrilled about the first time I listened to this, I think those songs have actually kind of grown on me a bit, to the point where I do actually enjoy them more. I mean, I'm not really listening to this constantly. That said, I don't really throw on a lot of these tracks on my car, for instance, or something I talk about a lot, as far as a measure of how well an album holds up. But I do listen to this all the way through occasionally, and listening to it again brought me back to the first time I listened to that, where I was actually really excited about it, because I didn't know what to expect when I heard That's the Spirit. I mean, the first song they released, "Drown," for instance, that song, the single, which they released a music video for, which actually sounds different than the actual album version. The album version is a little bit more energetic and more rock influenced, I would say. And I wasn't sure what to expect, because you could hear Bring Me Horizon in there, but it was a huge change. It was a much slower song that they had done. It's a much more emotional and powerful song that they had done in the past, really. And I wasn't sure what to expect for the rest of the album. And as the singles started coming out, I realized how different their sound actually was. So listening to the first time, I was kind of excited but nervous that I was only going to like a few songs and hate the rest. But every time I listen to it then and now, for instance, I still listen to it all the way through because I think they did just such a fantastic job with it that, you know, it's not another Suicide Seasons. It's not another any of Count Your Blessings. It's something completely different, and I'm sure that it has alienated a lot of fans in the sense that people who are looking for them to sound exactly like those other albums, or at least something carry on that sound similar, something similar to it. Like at least Sempiternal had that heaviness that that people were looking for in the streaming and things that isn't on this album, and I think that that's why this album just works so well. You know, it's experimental. It's, for the band at least, I mean, it's nothing I would call really progressive in terms of the genre, but it's still the band willing to kind of branch out a little bit, willing not to take some chances that may alienate fans, that probably have alienated fans. And I really feel that this album just does stand the test of time.